There is a way of growing food that is so old it predates every modern nation on earth. It was practiced in ancient China. It was refined in the gardens of Paris. It was taught to millions of Americans during the deadliest conflict in human history. And then, within a single generation after the war ended, it quietly disappeared from American life. Not because it failed, not because something better replaced it. It disappeared because it worked too well for the wrong people. This is not a fringe technique. This is not some trendy hack from social media. This is a complete food-growing system that has been tested across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations. And the fact that most Americans alive today have never heard of it tells you more about the last 70 years of agricultural policy than any textbook ever could. The roots of this system go back at least 4,000 years. In ancient China, farmers developed methods of intensive cultivation that sustained some of the densest populations on Earth without mechanization, without synthetic chemicals, and without destroying their soil. They composted everything. They planted crops close together in carefully designed combinations. They built their soil deeper and richer with each passing season, rather than stripping it down. Western observers who encountered these methods centuries later were stunned. In 1911, a USDA soil scientist named F.H. King traveled through China, Korea, and Japan and documented what he found. He published a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. What he described was an agricultural system that had fed billions of people across millennia without ever depleting the land. The book was considered remarkable, and then it was largely forgotten. But Asia was not the only place where this knowledge existed. In 18th and 19th century Paris, a group of market gardeners known as the maraîchers developed their own version of intensive growing that became legendary across Europe. These were not wealthy landowners. These were working people, farming tiny plots inside and around the city. They used deep hand-prepared beds, heavy composting, close plant spacing, and succession planting to produce staggering quantities of food on almost no land. Some of them grew 9 harvests a year from the same beds. They fed Paris. They did it without tractors. They did it without chemical inputs. They did it on plots so small that a modern American suburbanite would consider them inadequate for a patio. French intensive gardening, as it came to be called, was studied, admired, and replicated. It spread to England and eventually crossed the Atlantic. By the early 20th century, Americans had access to a deep well of knowledge about how to grow large amounts of food on small pieces of land. And then came the wars. During World War I, the United States government encouraged citizens to plant what were called war gardens. The idea was simple. Every pound of food grown at home freed up supply for the troops overseas. Americans responded. Millions of small gardens appeared across the country. It worked, and the knowledge that powered those gardens was rooted in the same intensive principles that had sustained civilizations for centuries: deep soil, dense planting, composting, efficient use of water and space. Then it happened again. During World War II, the Victory Garden campaign became one of the most successful food mobilization efforts in modern history. At its peak, roughly 20 million American households were growing food. These gardens produced an estimated 40% of the fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. 40%. Not from industrial farms, not from supply chains. From backyards, community plots, rooftops, and vacant lots. The government printed guides. Extension agents taught classes. Neighbors shared knowledge across fences. For a brief and extraordinary moment, a huge portion of the American population understood how to feed itself. And then the war ended, and everything changed. What happened next was not a natural evolution. It was a pivot. and it was driven by economics far more than by logic. During the war, American industrial capacity had been focused on producing explosives, synthetic rubber, and chemical weapons. The Haber-Bosch process, which had been developed to synthesize ammonia for German munitions during World War I, had become the backbone of nitrogen production. When the fighting stopped, the factories did not. They needed new markets, and they found one in American soil. The same nitrogen that had filled bombs was reformulated into synthetic fertilizer. The same chemical companies that had supplied the war effort began supplying farms, and a new model of agriculture took hold, one built on chemical inputs, mechanization, and scale. The message from industry and government shifted almost overnight. Growing your own food was no longer patriotic. It was unnecessary. The future was industrial. The future was convenient. The future was the supermarket. Extension services that had spent years teaching Americans how to grow food pivoted to supporting commercial agriculture. The knowledge pipeline reversed. Instead of empowering households, the system began encouraging dependence. And within a single generation, the deep, ancient knowledge of intensive food growing that had been practiced for 4,000 years and had reached its widest American adoption during wartime faded from common understanding. It was not outlawed. It was not disproven. It was simply no longer passed down. This follows a pattern that shows up again and again in economic history. When a population can provide something essential for itself, it is very difficult to sell that thing to them. A household that grows its own tomatoes does not buy tomatoes. A family that produces a significant share of its own calories is far less dependent on grocery supply chains, far less affected by food price inflation, and far less valuable as a consumer. The economic incentive was never to keep Americans growing food. The economic incentive was to make them stop. And it worked. Today, the average American household has almost no food production capacity. Most people under 60 have never grown a meaningful amount of their own food. The knowledge is not gone from the earth, but it has been pushed to the margins, kept alive by a small number of practitioners, researchers, and writers who understood what was being lost. One of those people was an Englishman named Alan Chadwick. In the 1960s, Chadwick arrived at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and began teaching a method that combined French intensive techniques with deep organic soil building. His students were astonished by the results. The gardens he created produced yields that university agronomists initially refused to believe. One of those students was a young man named John Jeavons, and what Jeavons did over the next 5 decades may be one of the most underappreciated contributions to food security in American history. Jeavons took what Chadwick taught, combined it with research into ancient growing methods from around the world, and refined it into a complete, replicable system he called Grow Biointensive. The method is built on a set of principles that would have been immediately recognizable to a Chinese farmer 4,000 years ago, or a Parisian market gardener 200 years ago. Deep soil preparation, usually by hand, to a depth of 24 inches. Heavy use of compost to build living soil. Close spacing of plants in wide beds to create a canopy that retains moisture and suppresses weeds. Companion planting, carbon-focused crop planting, and the use of open-pollinated seeds so that growers can save their own seed and never become dependent on outside suppliers. The results are difficult to argue with. Jeavons and his organization, Ecology Action, have demonstrated over decades of documented research that this method can produce a complete diet for one person on roughly 4,000 square feet of land. That is less than 1/10 of an acre. That is a large backyard. The method uses 67 to 88% less water than conventional agriculture. It uses no synthetic fertilizers. It uses no pesticides. And instead of depleting soil, it builds it. In an era when the United Nations warns that the world may have only 60 years of topsoil left at current rates of industrial farming, a system that actively creates soil is not a curiosity. It is a necessity. And here is the part that should give every American pause. This knowledge is available right now. Jeavons published a book decades ago called How to Grow More Vegetables, and it has been translated into more than 30 languages and used in over 150 countries. The method is being practiced in some of the poorest and most food-insecure places on Earth, from sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, precisely because it requires no expensive inputs and works on small plots of marginal land. It works in drought. It works in poor soil. It works in places where people have no access to machinery or chemicals. And it works in an American backyard just as well as it works anywhere else. The question is not whether the system functions. That was settled thousands of years ago and confirmed again by decades of modern research. The question is why so few Americans know about it. And once you understand the economic structure that benefits from a population that buys its food rather than grows it, the answer is not complicated. This is not about going back to some imagined past. This is not about rejecting modern life. This is about recognizing that a critical piece of knowledge, one that your grandparents likely had some version of, was quietly removed from the culture within living memory. It was replaced not by something better, but by something more profitable for the people selling it. The food system Americans depend on today is impressive in its scale and deeply fragile in its structure. It runs on long supply chains, fossil fuel inputs, and soil that is measurably thinner and less alive than it was a generation ago. Grocery prices have risen sharply and show no sign of returning to where they were, and the average household sits at the end of that chain with no fallback and no ability to opt out, not because growing food is hard, but because the knowledge of how to do it efficiently on a small plot was allowed to fade. What the Grow Biointensive method represents is not a radical idea. It is the opposite. It is the oldest and most proven idea in agriculture, refined for modern use and available to anyone willing to learn it. A 4,000 square foot garden, a few hand tools, compost, seeds you can save and replant, soil that gets better every year instead of worse. That is the system. It fed civilizations. It fed wartime America. It is feeding communities in over 100 countries right now. The only thing that changed is that someone decided you did not need to know about it.